In the heart of Greenhaven, Connecticut, nestled in a mansion that gleamed with wealth and status, Claire Hastings was the epitome of perfection. Her life was a symphony of private schools, high society gatherings, and the constant pressure to maintain an image as flawless as her family's reputation. She had it all: beauty, brains, and a future that seemed paved in gold. Yet behind her pristine smile and polished appearance, Claire lived a life full of contradictions, one that few would ever imagine. Her mother, Margaret Hastings, a woman whose name was synonymous with power and elegance in Connecticut's elite circles, had raised Claire with a strict hand. From an early age, Claire was taught that her worth was tied to the world's perception of her. She was groomed to be perfect, to uphold the family name with dignity. Henry Hastings, her father, a successful business tycoon, was hardly ever around, absorbed in his empire, leaving Claire to feel like a ghost in her own home. Despite their wealth and high status, Claire had never felt truly seen by her parents. They were too busy to love her in the way she desperately needed. But Claire wasn't alone. She had built her identity around the idea of being the perfect daughter. She carried the burden of expectation on her shoulders, and like a finely honed machine, she performed each role with perfection. Whether it was excelling academically or attending gala after gala, she was always at the top of her game. But this perfection came at a steep cost. Deep within, Claire wrestled with feelings of emptiness, a profound disconnect between her public self and her inner self. It was in the midst of this pressure, amidst the glitz and glamour, that Claire found herself at a charity event in Boston, Massachusetts in October 2022. The glittering ballroom was filled with the social elite, all exchanging pleasantries, as Claire made her way through the crowd. She was accustomed to the attention, the compliments, but tonight something felt different. It wasn't just the usual small talk that bored her to tears. Tonight, she was looking for something more, something real. As she stood by the grand piano, her eyes met Ethan Calloway, a man who seemed to glow with authenticity in a room full of polished facades. Ethan, with his modest upbringing in Ashford, Vermont, was a stark contrast to the world Claire had known. His easy smile, the way he spoke about his work in conservation and his deep love for nature, captivated her. He wasn't impressed by her wealth or status, and that, in itself, was a novelty. For Ethan, it was her intelligence and quiet strength that drew him in. He saw past the exterior, the perfectly curated image of Claire Hastings, and what he saw was a woman of depth, someone who, despite her facade, longed for something more than the life her family had planned for her. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and it felt like a spark ignited between them. Ethan was everything Claire had been taught to dismiss: simple, grounded, and real. And yet, he was everything she had ever wanted. By the end of the night, Ethan had made Claire laugh in a way no one else had. She found herself drawn to him, craving the normality he represented, even as she knew she could never escape the world of expectations that surrounded her. Ethan Calloway wasn't part of her world, but somehow, she couldn't stop thinking about him. And so, a few weeks later, in February 2023, during a romantic getaway in Costa Rica, Ethan dropped to one knee and asked Claire to marry him. The diamond ring he presented was ethically sourced, symbolizing everything he believed in: sustainability, honesty, and integrity. It was a symbol of the life they could build together, far from the pressures of the world she had grown up in. But in Claire's heart, something felt different. As Ethan eagerly awaited her response, Claire froze, caught between the love she felt for him and the weight of everything she had been conditioned to be. She wanted this. She longed for a life with him, but something inside her whispered that it wasn't enough, that she wasn't enough. In the end, Claire said yes. But the decision wasn't without a deep sense of guilt. She was agreeing to a future that seemed perfect on the surface, but her doubts loomed large. What would it mean to leave behind the life of luxury and expectations her family had created for her? Could she truly be herself with Ethan? Or would she be forced to hide the truth, forever locked in the role she had been born into? Tension was building in Claire's life. The illusion of perfection was beginning to crack, but she had no idea how far those cracks would spread. As Ethan Calloway promised a future filled with love, Claire was starting to wonder if that love could ever fill the emptiness she had carried with her for so long. Little did she know, the perfect wedding that awaited her was about to be shattered in the most devastating way imaginable. The path she had chosen would not be as simple as love conquering all, and the truth was about to come crashing down around her. Claire Hastings' life, once meticulously structured, was beginning to feel like it was spiraling out of control. She had married Ethan Calloway, the man she believed could provide the stability and love she had longed for, but the deeper she got into their relationship, the more her doubts festered. As their wedding date loomed closer, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was trapped between two worlds, the one she had always known, filled with wealth, expectations, and appearances, and the life she was trying to build with Ethan, grounded in love, simplicity, and authenticity. But the more she leaned into her life with Ethan, the more she realized that her inner turmoil, her need for excitement, passion, and validation, was not going away. In fact, it seemed to be growing stronger. Their home in Ashford, Vermont was everything Claire had imagined it would be, cozy, simple, and full of love. Ethan was everything she had hoped for, gentle, caring, and supportive. Yet, the constant pressure to conform to her family's standards never fully left her. Claire couldn't help but compare this life with the one she had been born into, the elegant Greenhaven mansion, the charity galas, the endless stream of high society events that demanded her perfection. It was all so far removed from the reality of her life with Ethan. Despite his gentle nature, Ethan's unwavering sense of duty toward the environment, his passion for conservation, and his belief in a sustainable, modest lifestyle began to feel suffocating to Claire. His view of the world was so different from hers. It wasn't about impressing people, about making a grand statement. It was about making small, meaningful changes. But Claire's desires, her need for validation and excitement, started to simmer just beneath the surface. She couldn't ignore the dull ache in her chest, the restless energy she had carried with her for years, the part of her that longed to escape her family's grip on her life. And as she found herself retreating further into her relationship with Ethan, the past began to knock at the door. Dylan Calloway had been Ethan's cousin for years, a man Claire had known for just as long, though in a more distant way. But recently, things had changed. Dylan had always been the charming black sheep of the family, a man who lived a fast life, who was always seeking thrills in places Ethan couldn't understand. It was no surprise that he was invited to their wedding preparations. But there was something more to his presence that Claire couldn't ignore. Dylan was a magnetic force. His mere presence filled a room, drawing attention effortlessly with his sharp wit and handsome features. Where Ethan was steady and predictable, Dylan was spontaneous and reckless. And it was that very spontaneity that began to appeal to Claire more and more. In those stolen moments when she would find herself in Dylan's company, her heart would race in a way she hadn't felt in ages. It wasn't just the excitement of being around someone who was different, it was the thrill of being seen in a way she wasn't used to. Dylan didn't care about her family's wealth, didn't expect her to be perfect. He didn't see her as an object to be displayed but as a woman with desires and weaknesses, flaws that he seemed to understand. Their first encounter alone was innocent enough. Dylan had come over to help Claire with some wedding planning details, but the tension between them was palpable. As they stood together in the dimly lit study of their home in Ashford, discussing flower arrangements and guest lists, the casual touch of his hand brushing against hers sent a jolt through her body. Claire's heart raced, and for a moment, it felt as if time had slowed down. She pulled back, feeling the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, but Dylan's eyes locked with hers in a way that made her question everything she thought she wanted. For weeks, this subtle, charged energy between them simmered, barely noticeable to Ethan but impossible to ignore for Claire. Every glance exchanged, every lingering moment together, made her question her commitment to Ethan. What was it that Dylan offered her that Ethan couldn't? Was it the excitement? The unpredictability? Or was it simply that Dylan saw her in a way no one else did? As Ethan focused more on his work, increasingly engrossed in his environmental projects, Claire found herself drawn to Dylan's chaos, to his ability to make her feel alive in a way Ethan never had. One evening, while Ethan was away for work, Dylan invited Claire to meet him at a quiet bar in Tribeca, Manhattan, a location known for its secrecy and discreet atmosphere. It was just supposed to be a casual meeting to discuss some final details about the wedding, but as they sat across from each other, the chemistry between them was undeniable. The conversation turned personal, and Claire, feeling the weight of her doubts about her future, opened up to Dylan about her feelings, about the suffocation she felt from her family and her growing discomfort with her life as it was. Dylan listened intently, and as he reached across the table, his hand brushed against hers once again. The connection between them was no longer just a fleeting glance or a shared joke, it had evolved into something far more dangerous. As Claire looked into Dylan's eyes, she saw a reflection of everything she had ever wanted, everything that had been missing from her life. For the first time in months, she felt seen, desired, and powerful. Dylan leaned in closer, his breath warm against her cheek, and in a moment of complete weakness, Claire allowed herself to kiss him. The kiss was electric, filled with all the pent-up frustration, excitement, and longing Claire had been suppressing for years. But in the back of her mind, there was a nagging voice telling her this was wrong. Still, she couldn't stop herself. Dylan's lips were everything she hadn't realized she needed. As she pulled away, Claire's mind raced. What had she done? She had promised Ethan that she would marry him, that they would build a life together. But now, in the quiet of the bar, in the haze of desire, the truth hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the life Ethan had offered her. The next morning, Claire woke up to the sharp sting of guilt, but also to a burning curiosity. Could she live without the thrill that Dylan gave her? And what did that mean for her future with Ethan? The more she tried to push the feelings aside, the more they consumed her, leaving her trapped between the man who loved her and the man who made her feel truly alive. The grand ballroom at Willowridge Manor was a sight to behold. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a soft golden glow over the guests. The air was filled with the hum of excited chatter, the gentle strumming of a string quartet in the corner, and the intoxicating scent of white roses and lilies. Everything was perfect. This was supposed to be the happiest day of Claire's life, her wedding day, the day she would marry Ethan Calloway, the man she had promised herself to. But behind her flawless smile and the elegant gown she wore, a storm was brewing, a storm that no one, not even Ethan, could have seen coming. As Claire stood in front of the mirror in the bridal suite, her reflection seemed almost foreign to her. The intricate lace of her dress shimmered in the light, but her heart was a heavy weight in her chest. She ran a trembling hand through her hair, the same hand that had brushed Dylan's just a few days ago, the same hand that had kissed him in secret. Ethan had no idea. He had no idea that every step of this day, every vow she was about to take, was a lie. Just a few rooms away, Ethan stood by the window, gazing out at the sprawling estate. He was trying to calm his racing heart, but his mind kept circling back to the unsettling feeling that had been growing inside him over the last few weeks. Claire had been distant, colder than usual, and it wasn't just the stress of wedding planning. He had noticed the way she looked at him with a kind of detachment, how she would often be distracted, lost in her thoughts when he spoke to her. But what could he say? The wedding was too close. It had to happen. She had to be the one. The door to the bridal suite creaked open, and Margaret Hastings, Claire's mother, stepped inside, her icy eyes scanning her daughter. "You're perfect," she said, her voice low and commanding, just as it had always been. Claire gave a tight-lipped smile, but her mother's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. It was as if she sensed something was off, but she said nothing, only nodded and turned to leave, leaving Claire alone in her thoughts. In the adjacent room, Dylan Calloway paced restlessly. He had arrived earlier than expected, and there was something about the air tonight that felt off. He'd already caught Ethan's suspicious glances, the subtle way his cousin had been watching him lately. But tonight, Dylan could feel it, the tension, the guilt, the impending explosion. And then, there was the undeniable truth, the affair. The weight of it was crushing him, and yet, he couldn't stop himself. The thrill of the forbidden had a grip on him that he could no longer deny. The clock on the wall ticked down, each second passing like a countdown to disaster. At last, the time had come. The wedding ceremony was about to begin, and everything seemed like it was going according to plan. Claire stood at the entrance, clutching her bouquet with white knuckles. The music began to swell, and she took her first step down the aisle, her eyes catching Ethan's across the room. He was standing tall, smiling, his heart open and eager, unaware of the storm that was about to break. But as Claire walked, something shifted. The air grew heavier, the weight of her secrets pressing down on her chest. Her vision blurred, and her steps faltered. She felt the eyes of the guests on her, but it wasn't the spotlight she feared. It was the look in Ethan's eyes. She had known this man for so long, had built a future with him, but now, as she walked toward him, her heart raced with the knowledge that everything she had built with him was about to crumble. And then, when she reached the altar, the worst of her fears came to life. Ethan didn't wait for the vows. As the officiant turned toward him, Ethan took a deep breath, his voice steady but laced with pain. "Claire," he began, his gaze never leaving her, "I stand here today, not to recite vows of love and fidelity, but to speak a truth that can no longer be ignored." The room went silent. Guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, sensing the change in the air. Claire's heart thudded in her chest, a sudden wave of nausea hitting her as the words hung in the air like a heavy mist. "For weeks," Ethan continued, his voice breaking slightly, "I've suspected that the woman I thought I knew, the woman I was prepared to spend my life with, has been living a lie." Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened in horror. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. How could he know? How could he have figured it out? "I know about the affair," Ethan's words cut through the air, cold and harsh. "I know what's been happening between you and my cousin." The gasp that rippled through the crowd felt like a physical blow. Claire's eyes darted to Dylan, who was standing beside Ethan, frozen in place, his face pale. His jaw was clenched, his eyes avoiding Claire's. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Ethan knew. He had known for weeks. He had been watching, suspecting, but never confronting. Until now. "Dylan Calloway," Ethan spat, his voice trembling with fury, "the man I trusted as a brother. The man who stood beside me when I needed him. And this is how you repay me?" Claire felt her legs give way beneath her. She stumbled, barely catching herself, her hands shaking violently. How had it come to this? The truth she had been hiding, the secret she had fought to protect, was now out in the open. As Ethan turned to her, his eyes full of betrayal, her heart shattered. She had no more lies to tell. "Claire," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've broken something in me that I can never fix. You've broken something in us." The room was still. The silence was deafening. Claire could feel the weight of every eye in the room, every judgment, every accusation. She wanted to run. To hide. To undo what had been done. But it was too late. The damage was done. Just as Claire opened her mouth to speak, to beg for forgiveness, she heard the soft click of a gun being drawn. Dylan. Without warning, Dylan pulled a gun from inside his jacket. The silence was shattered by the sound of metal against fabric. The gasps from the guests filled the air like a shockwave. Claire froze. Her heart stopped. "Dylan, no!" Claire screamed, but it was too late. The tension in the room snapped as Dylan, eyes wild and unfocused, raised the weapon, his finger hovering on the trigger. "You've ruined everything," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. I lost her. I lost everything. Before anyone could react, the sound of a gunshot rang through the air. The world seemed to stop. Time stretched out in an agonizing slow motion as Claire's body crumpled to the ground, blood staining the white of her wedding dress. Ethan screamed, running to her side, but it was too late. Claire, the woman he had trusted, the woman he had loved, was gone. And in that moment, Ethan's world shattered into 1,000 pieces, his heart heavy with grief and anger. And Dylan? Dylan stood frozen, the weight of his actions dawning on him far too late, the gun slipping from his hand as his world, too, came crashing down. The chaos that followed was a blur of frantic movements, screams, and desperate attempts to save Claire's life. But there was no saving her. Not anymore. The atmosphere at Willow Ridge Manor was suffocating, the once beautiful ballroom now turned into a chaotic, grim spectacle. The sounds of frantic voices, sirens in the distance, and the heavy thud of footsteps echoed through the hall, but none of it seemed to matter. The horror of what had just transpired, the gunshot, the blood, the screams, had frozen everything in place, leaving behind only the thick, oppressive air of tragedy. Ethan cradled Claire's lifeless body in his arms, his own hands trembling as they pressed against the wound on her chest. The blood spread quickly, staining the white lace of her wedding dress a deep crimson. His heart pounded violently against his ribcage, each beat a reminder of the agonizing reality that had unfolded before his eyes. His fingers trembled as he tried to stop the bleeding, his mind racing, unable to grasp the truth of what had happened. Claire, the woman he loved, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, was slipping away in his arms, and there was nothing he could do to save her. Nothing at all. Claire, please, stay with me. Ethan's voice cracked, desperation dripping from his every word. But Claire's eyes fluttered only once more before they closed for the final time. She was gone. The guests were paralyzed, caught in the storm of disbelief and horror. Some of them had fled the moment the gunshot rang out, their minds too overwhelmed by the violence to process what was happening. Others stood frozen in shock, unable to tear their eyes away from the grim scene in front of them. But all of them shared one undeniable truth: their once perfect celebration of love had turned into a nightmare none of them could wake from. Dylan, standing motionless a few feet away, watched the scene unfold as if in a trance. His hand, still gripping the gun, was shaking violently. He had pulled the trigger without thinking, driven by rage, jealousy, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. But now, in the silence that followed, the weight of his actions crushed him. He had destroyed everything. The horror on Ethan's face was more than he could bear. As he looked into his cousin's eyes, Dylan realized too late what he had done. He had betrayed not only Ethan but also Claire, who had once been his confidant, his temptation, his secret. And now, in a single, irreversible moment, he had shattered all of it. He had taken her life. Ethan slowly looked up, his eyes filled with pure, searing rage, disbelief still lingering in the pain. You killed her." His voice was a low growl, filled with uncontainable fury. The words seemed to rip from his chest, and for a split second, Dylan's mind could not comprehend the force of the hate emanating from his cousin. Ethan's voice, though strained, rang through the air, the accusation more painful than any physical blow. Dylan's mouth opened, but no words came out. What could he say? What excuse could ever justify the violence he had just unleashed? The truth was, there was nothing at all. There was only the crushing realization that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Ethan's gaze flickered to the gun still lying in Dylan's hand, then back to the broken body of Claire. His heart pounded in his chest, a dark storm of fury and grief rising within him. "I trusted you. I loved you like a brother," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper, but the hurt was unmistakable. "And you did this." The room felt like it was closing in on him. The weight of the loss, the betrayal, was suffocating. Ethan wanted to scream, to destroy everything in sight, but his body was frozen, held hostage by the unbearable reality of the moment. Claire's cold, lifeless body was still in his arms, and her blood stained his hands, the hands that had promised her a future. As the police arrived and the chaos intensified, Dylan was quickly restrained by guests who had stayed behind, his body limp, almost defeated. He was arrested on the spot, his fate sealed by his own actions. But there was no relief for him. No sense of justice. Just the haunting image of Claire's face, the woman he had fallen for and lost in a moment of pure recklessness. The following days were a blur. Dylan was charged with second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The family that had once celebrated their privileged lives in luxury was now left to pick up the pieces of their shattered world. The Hastings family, once so proud of their wealth and status, was left grieving in silence, unable to comprehend the depth of the betrayal. Ethan, unable to bear the pain of Claire's death, left Ashford, Vermont, and retreated into the remote wilderness areas he had once fought to protect. He disappeared into the quiet, harsh beauty of nature, the only solace he could find after the destruction of everything he had ever believed in. His career in conservation, once his greatest passion, now seemed meaningless in the face of such loss. The future he had imagined with Claire was now just a series of haunting memories. Margaret Hastings, Claire's mother, was inconsolable, her perfect family now forever broken. The woman who had once prided herself on her ability to control every aspect of her daughter's life now had to face the terrifying reality that her own need for perfection had driven Claire to a place where she sought comfort in the arms of betrayal. Claire's tragic death had destroyed her family's legacy, leaving nothing but the bitter taste of regret. The tragedy that unfolded at Willow Ridge Manor left behind not just a dead bride, but a shattered family, a broken man, and a lifetime of consequences. Ethan's pain was palpable, and despite the rage that had consumed him in the moments after Claire's death, he could not shake the thought that he had failed her. He had loved her unconditionally, and yet, the one thing he could never give her, the freedom to be herself, had driven her into the arms of another man. But in the silence of his grief, Ethan found something: forgiveness. He could not change what had happened. He could not undo the pain, the loss, or the betrayal. But in his heart, he knew that he had to forgive, not only Dylan but himself. Only then could he find the peace he desperately needed. The tragedy had taught him a cruel lesson: the weight of expectations, the desire for perfection, and the lies we tell ourselves will always come crashing down, no matter how hard we try to hold them up. The days that followed Claire Hastings' tragic death were a blur of grief, guilt, and disbelief. The bright, promising future that had once lay ahead now felt like a distant memory, a cruel reminder of everything that had been lost in the blink of an eye. As the world around Ethan Calloway began to crumble, he retreated from the wreckage, disappearing into the remote wilderness of Vermont. Gone was the passionate conservationist, the man who had once been full of hope for the future. In his place was a hollow shell of a man, tortured by memories of love, betrayal, and a loss he could never undo. He wandered through the forest as if the trees and the rivers could offer him solace, but nothing could quiet the storm raging inside him. His hands trembled when he touched the bark of the trees, a futile attempt to ground himself in the world he had known. Claire's face haunted him, her laugh, her smile, the way she had looked at him with such love just days before everything fell apart. And then there was the image of her lifeless body, the blood on his hands. He had held her, begging her to stay alive, knowing all too well that nothing could save her. That memory was seared into his soul. Ethan had once believed in love's power to heal and protect. But now, after losing Claire in the most violent, heartbreaking way, he was unsure of everything. Was love really enough? Could trust be rebuilt after such devastation? Could he ever forgive Dylan, the man he had trusted like a brother, the man who had shattered everything with one fatal act? The pain of betrayal crushed him. Dylan had always been the impulsive, reckless one, the cousin who would never settle down, always chasing fleeting thrills. But Ethan had never imagined that he would be the one to destroy the life they had worked so hard to build. Now, in his isolated cabin in the wilderness, all Ethan could do was reflect on the futility of it all. The world outside was silent, but the screams in his head never stopped. He thought back to the first time he had met Claire, the way she had smiled at him, her eyes wide with excitement and love. He had believed in that love with all his heart. He had been ready to sacrifice everything for her, to give her a life of stability, to protect her from the pressures of her family, from the weight of perfection that had crushed her spirit. But now, standing alone in the wild, he couldn't escape the nagging question that had been eating away at him since that fateful day: was it his fault? Had he somehow failed her? He had loved her so fiercely, but had his love been enough to hold her together? Or had he, too, been a part of the machine that broke her? Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a voice that echoed in the emptiness, a voice he had not heard in a long time. It was his father's voice, Henry Hastings, cold and distant, filled with judgment. "You should have known, Ethan. You should have seen it coming. You should have protected her better." But how could he have? How could anyone have predicted that Dylan, his cousin, the one person he trusted most, would turn on him, turn on Claire, and destroy everything they had? But in the crushing weight of these thoughts, Ethan realized something: forgiveness. Forgiveness for Claire, for Dylan, for himself. Could he forgive Dylan? Could he forgive Claire for the betrayal that had led them down this path? Could he forgive himself for not being enough, for not seeing the cracks in Claire's perfect world? The question weighed on him heavily, but as the days passed, he began to understand something crucial: forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean excusing what had happened. It meant finding peace despite the chaos, despite the pain. He knew he couldn't change what had happened. But he could change how he let it define him. He could choose to carry the memory of Claire's love, not as a burden, but as a gift. Her smile, her laughter, her warmth, they were his to keep, even though she was gone. And he could choose to forgive, not for Dylan's sake, but for his own. Because without forgiveness, the bitterness would consume him entirely. Dylan's life, too, had been irreparably shattered. The once charismatic man, full of charm and self-confidence, was now a shadow of his former self. Arrested for the murder of Claire, he sat in a cold prison cell, the weight of his actions crashing down on him with every passing hour. The power he once had, the control he had over people's perceptions, meant nothing now. He was alone, utterly alone with the consequences of his choices. The man who had once been the golden child of the Calloway family now sat with nothing but regret. He had destroyed his relationship with his cousin, destroyed Claire's life, and broken his own soul in the process. And the silence of the prison only reminded him of the depth of his mistake. Forgiveness, he realized, would never come easily to him. But as the years passed, it would be the only thing that could save him from his own self-destruction. As time went on, Ethan found peace, but not in the way he expected. He never forgot the pain, the loss, but he learned to live with it. He would visit the place where Claire was buried, standing in front of her headstone, and speak to her quietly, sharing his thoughts, his regrets, his forgiveness. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the trees in Vermont, Ethan would swear he could hear her voice, whispering through the branches, telling him it was okay, that he had done enough. This story has shown us that betrayal, no matter how small it seems in the beginning, can lead to destruction, of lives, of families, and of dreams. But it also teaches us that, in the end, forgiveness is the only way to find peace. It's not for the person who wronged us, it's for ourselves. Forgiveness is not forgetting, but finding peace despite the pain. What do you think? What would you do in Ethan's shoes? Could you forgive someone who betrayed you so deeply? Or would you hold on to the anger forever? Let us know in the comments below. We want to hear your thoughts on this heartbreaking story. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional true crime stories that explore the complexity of human relationships, betrayal, and redemption.